We are starting a new chapter today. It is chapter 23 from the book. And in this chapter, we are going to be asking two important questions. The first question is, what is economic growth? And I suspect some of you may already have some ideas, some notions about what constitutes as economic growth. Some of you may not, that's okay. We are going to be answering that question in this chapter. And once we do that, once we have answer for the first question, we are going to answer the second question, which is, where does this growth come from? What are the sources of this growth? Why do some countries grow and others don't? Or even if two countries are growing, why do they grow at different rates? These are some of the questions we will try to answer in this chapter. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of the chapter, let's just take a look at this table that I've compiled. And it gives us the growth rate of different countries, 4 different countries, between the period 2018 and 2021. So 2018, 2019 data we have. 2020 data, these are provisional data, they may not be final, and maybe they're subject to some small changes. And 2021 is, of course, forecasted data. Okay, so what we see over here is it's a very similar pattern between these 4 countries. Is that in 2018 these countries are experiencing growth. US has 3% growth, for example. Bangladesh has 7.86% growth. Similarly, in 2019 these countries are experiencing growth as well, but exactly the same amount, some more, some less. Then we come to 2020, which was the pandemic year, and we see a sharp decline in the growth rate of all the countries. So for Bangladesh, growth falls from 8.15% to 3.8%. For China, it falls from 5.82% to 2.27%. United States and India, who suffered much more during the pandemic, actually went through negative growth, which means that in the United States, in the year 2020, the economy contracted, got smaller by 3.51%, and in India, the contraction was almost 8%. However, it is forecasted that all 4 countries will bounce back strongly this year, 2021, and experience large growths. So this makes intuitive sense that there was growth, then we had a difficult year during which growth fell, and now it's expected that growth will bounce back. That makes sense, but that still doesn't answer the question that we want to answer, which is, what is growth? What is this growth? When I say that Bangladesh is going to experience 5.04% growth in 2021, what exactly does that mean? And the definition that's given in the book, I'm going to write it down. So economic growth is defined in the book as a persistent rise or increase in the level of potential GDP of a country. Okay. So a few things are important. So first thing, it has to be persistent rise. Okay, so just a 1-year rise isn't really enough. There has to be a persistent rise over a period of time. Okay, and the second important thing is that we're looking at potential GDP. Okay, so what we need to answer now is, what's the difference between GDP and potential GDP? What are they? So before we talk about this, let's go back to Eco 101, Introduction to Macroeconomics, and think about the concept of a PPF or a PPC. whatever you learned it as, a production possibility frontier or production possibility curve. And what that basically showed us, if I were to do a very rough sketch here of, let's say we have good x here and good y here, and it told us that if we are on, let's say, point A or point B, we are being efficient, we are using all our resources, and let's say if we were in point C, we were not being efficient and not using all our resources. So in macro, the way we are going to define potential GDP is by saying potential GDP is the level of production that can be sustained over a period of time, of course, by a country. Okay, so what does this mean? So the potential GDP, in very simple words, is the maximum amount of goods and services that a country can produce and maintain that level over a period of time. Okay, so if we were to move back to the diagram and let's look at a few points. Now point C is of course not the potential GDP. We're not being efficient here. We can produce a lot more. So C is not potential GDP. Is D potential GDP? Not really. In Eco 101, we said that producing at D is not possible. Now we are going to relax that slightly, and in Eco 102, we are going to say that it may be possible to produce at D for a short period of time, but this is not sustainable. We cannot maintain this production for a long period of time. So if D is not potential GDP either, point A and point B are potential GDPs. So effectively, when we are producing on the PPF, when we're being efficient and using all our resources, which are shown by point A and point B, we are producing at our potential. At point C, we are not using all our resources, doesn't work. And at point D, we are producing at a level that's too high to be persisted or to be sustained over a long period of time. So these are not potential. Okay, so what's the difference between GDP and potential GDP? Well, potential GDP are, as I said, A or B. Okay, these are production levels that can be sustained over a period of time. What is GDP, however? GDP can be A, it can be B, it can be C, it can be D, or it can be basically any point. It can be any point, okay? In the short run, we may be at C, and then that's our GDP for the country. In the short run, we may also be on point D, and then D is our GDP. But sooner or later, we will have to move back to point A or B or some other point on the PPF. So that's the difference between GDP and potential GDP. And economic growth, according to the book, is a persistent rise in the level of potential GDP of a country. So which basically means, I'm going to draw another diagram. So same thing, we have X, we have Y, and suppose this is what we have. Okay, potential GDP, economic growth needs potential GDP to increase. So if we were initially in point A and then we move to point B, move from A to B, we are producing more. Our GDP has increased, but this is not economic growth, because our potential GDP has not increased. Even as we were producing at point A, it was possible for us to produce at point B. Nothing has changed. All we're doing due to this move is we are now producing to our full capacity, or producing to our potentials. However, if this happens, our PPF goes out, and as a result, what we can now do is go from point B to point C. So when we move from point B to point C, this is an example of economic growth, because while we were at point B, we were producing at our maximum capacity, and it was not possible for us to produce at C over a sustained period of time. But now, for whatever reason, we have moved to a new PPF which allows us to produce at C. So this is an example of economic growth. Okay, so I hope that's clear to all of us. Now, there are different ways of calculating economic growth. We are going to take a look at about 2 or 3 of them. The easiest one is, of course, to calculate the GDP growth rate. Okay, so the formula for that is, of course, GDP of a period T, minus GDP of the previous period divided by GDP of the previous period times 100%. So if I were to give an example, so suppose GDP of country A in the year 2019 was 10 billion, and then GDP for country A in the next period, year 2020, has gone up to, let's say, 15 billion. And we want to calculate the GDP growth rate of country A. So GDP growth will be simply 15 billion minus 10 billion divided by 10 billion times 100%. So what we get is 50%. So once we get this figure, what we will write is that between 2019 and 2020, the GDP of country A increased 50%. And so then we can say that the country has experienced 50% growth rate. Okay, so this is one way of doing it. But of course there is a problem with this, and many of you would have already noticed it, is that when we calculate GDP growth, this does not tell us anything about what we can buy with this amount. So basically what I mean is that our calculation is showing us that there has been a growth of 50%, which is trying to tell us is that, or actually I've written it down, GDP was 10 billion. This year GDP is 15 billion. So GDP has gone up by 5 billion. Okay, but what do we care about what GDP is? What we care about, let's put dollars here, dollars. What we really care about is what we can buy with these goods, right? Our GDP has gone up by 50%. But if we've also experienced inflation of 50%, then effectively this rise in GDP isn't really going to change anything. The standard of living is going to remain the same in the country. For a rise of GDP of 50%, if inflation has been 100%, then actually what we are going to see is that people have effectively less money than they had in the previous year. So the second method that we are going to see of calculating growth is to calculate real GDP growth. And you all know what real is. We've gone through inflation in this course. So effectively real GDP is GDP adjusted for inflation. And formula is the same here. So real GDP in period T minus real GDP in period T minus 1 divided by real GDP in T minus 1 times 100%. Okay, so at least when we do this, what we are doing is we're adjusting for inflation. So for example, if GDP has gone up by 5%, but inflation has been 3%, then we can at least say that after adjusting for inflation, the real GDP has grown by around 2%. That's fine. But there is still a problem with this. So when we are using real GDP growth, the problem is this does not tell us anything about standard of living. What do I mean by that? Take a look at China, which has a population of around 1.4 billion, and Bangladesh population is around 165 million. Now, if we take a look at the GDP of two countries, GDP of China and GDP of Bangladesh. So what we are going to see is that China has a GDP, in 2020, China had a GDP of 14.72 trillion, and Bangladesh had a GDP of, how much was it? Around 320 billion. Okay. And if we are focusing just on these two figures, what it would seem to suggest is that China has a standard of living 45 times higher than Bangladesh. Now, does that really make sense? Do you think an average person in China has a standard of living that is 45 times higher than Bangladesh? Not really. And so that's the problem with just looking at GDP. What we also have to do is adjust for population. And so we come to the third way of calculating growth is real GDP per capita, not capital, per capita growth, which is equals to, of course, you guys can figure out what the formula will be. Real GDP per capita in period T minus real GDP per capita period T minus 1 divided by real GDP per capita T minus 1 times 100. Okay. How do we calculate real GDP per capita? This is simply the real GDP divided by population. So when we divide by population, we see that how much let's say resource there is for each person in the country, and when we adjust for that, what we see, okay, let me write this down. So we have Bangladesh, we have China, let's say we have real GDP, and we saw that Bangladesh had 320 billion, China had 14.72 billion, and it looked like just based on these two, it looked like China had 45 times better standard of living. However, if we use real GDP per capita, then what we see is that Bangladesh is at 1305 and China is at 8405. Okay, and what that means is the standard of living in China is approximately 6 times higher than what there is in Bangladesh. Now this is a much more realistic scenario. We can do a lot more analysis, and the real gap is actually smaller than this, but this is, of course, this makes a lot more sense than this. It's not feasible that someone in China, an average person in China, has 45 times better life standard of living than Bangladesh, but 6, this makes more sense. So that's why using real GDP growth is better than using GDP growth, and using real GDP per capita growth is better than real GDP growth when we're trying to calculate economic growth of a country. Okay, so so far what we have done, let me sum up before I end the video. We have defined economic growth 1, and then we have seen how to, we have calculated economic growth. So these are the two things that we have done so far. So now we can answer, like, remember I said we will answer 2 questions. First one was what is economic growth? We have answered this. Now we come to the second and more critical question, which is where does economic growth come from?